Now, as we begin our study, first and foremost, a very basic and important principle about the book of Job. You have to take the book on its own terms. I will begin to illustrate that very quickly, but what I mean is this. Job will say certain things, and you will come with your own preconceptions, and you will want to filter out things that Job says. You will find, well, I don't like that. You may not consciously say that to yourself, but that's what you'll be thinking. And you will screen very heavily what Job is saying. Job the man and Job the book. So just listen to the words. Take them at their face value. And very soon you're going to see where that really is an important issue. Now, what kind of book is Job? Job belongs to the corpus of wisdom literature, and wisdom literature in the Old Testament is quite distinctive. Turns out, well, when I say wisdom literature, what do I mean? I mean Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, and you could include in there Song of Songs. But wisdom literature is a great stumbling block to Old Testament scholarship. Because when you do Old Testament theology, you want to try to find some kind of defining pattern that governs the Old Testament. You know, the core of Old Testament theology. How the Old Testament works. What is the definition of the Old Testament and its message? And the books of wisdom almost always stand out. They don't fit. And different schools of thought, you know, whatever your view is of the theology of the Old Testament, whatever model you follow, they will tend to pound on the wisdom books to try to force them to fit the mold of their understanding of Old Testament theology. So we're going to begin, first of all, just by talking about the distinctive nature of Old Testament wisdom. Now, in my view, the Old Testament can be divided broadly into two bodies of texts. The first body of texts I call election literature. Election. The second body of texts, what I just alluded to, I call wisdom. Election literature is focused on the election of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then through them Israel. It is essentially founded on Genesis 12, 1-3. And broadly, it is God's program of redemption for humanity through the choosing of Israel. And then everything in all the election books, in one way or the other, deals with that. So when I say, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you slow down just a little?
Okay. I'll repeat myself some as well. Wisdom text, let me go back to that. The wisdom text, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. The election texts are everything else. So in Genesis you have kind of the prologue story in Genesis 1-11, the fall of humanity, all that sort of thing. And then you have the election of Abraham. And then the story of the patriarchs. Then the Exodus. And the birth of Israel at the Sinai covenant, Mount Sinai. The laws that are given to Israel as part of the Sinai covenant. The story of Israel, as it is told in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and so forth. The praises and songs of Israel. as in Psalms and Lamentations, and the delivery of the Word of God to Israel in the prophets. So everything is concerned with Israel, the elect nation, with their story, with their relationship to God, with God's purpose in electing them. Everything in those books really is focused on that one issue. God chose Israel for His purposes. Wisdom literature is quite different. That may strike you as quite surprising or even a little difficult and offensive at first, but let me make my case. What are the distinctives of wisdom literature? First, the issue of election. Wisdom literature is not grounded in the election of Israel. That is to say, there is no reference to Israel being the chosen people of God in wisdom literature. Now, there are historical references, like Solomon, king of Israel, wrote Ecclesiastes and so forth. But those are historical references. Specific references to the election of Israel and the purposes of election, as I think we will see, are lacking. In the election literature, everything is essentially focused on Torah as the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Torah gives the terms of the covenant, and it is for Israel. Thus, for example, in the book of Amos, Amos chapter 1 and 2, you have a series of condemnations that are delivered against a series of nations and Judah and Israel. It begins with Damascus. Who else does it include? The Philistines, Gaza, Moab, Edom, Ammon, Phoenicia. Condemnation is given against these nations, but the condemnation is always grounded in what you could call broadly understood crimes against humanity, like capturing people to enslave them, kidnapping them for slavery purposes, or ripping open a pregnant woman. You know, things anybody in any society would recognize as immoral. Only Judah and Israel are criticized for failure to keep Torah. The nations are not. So Torah is the focus, and the covenant, Torah is the content of the covenant, is the focus in election literature. By contrast, and I guess I should include this here, the moral focus of wisdom literature is creation. That is to say, in Proverbs chapter 8, you have Lady Wisdom giving a poem, a song. And Lady Wisdom talks about how she was present with God at the creation, how she was the first of His created acts of creation. And after she was made, she was with Him as He formed the earth. What's the point of talking about wisdom being present at the creation and being kind of a co-worker with God? The point is that wisdom is built into creation, by which I mean there is a moral order to the universe. We are made in a certain way. And if we live according to that pattern, we will do well, we'll thrive. If we fight against that pattern, we destroy ourselves. So a simple example, Proverbs talks a lot about adultery and how destructive it is. And the basic idea is God made us to be monogamous. That is in our nature. And if we get into promiscuity, if we get into adultery or any other of the various sexual sins, it's not just that we're offending God. We are. We are offending God, but we are going against how we are built. We are going against our inner nature. And thus we're destroying ourselves. It's just like trying to defy the law of gravity. The moral structure of the human race and of the whole world is wisdom. So, for example, again in Proverbs you have numerous references to the sluggard, the lazy guy. And the basic idea is if you are lazy, you will starve. If you are lazy, you will have nothing. And that's just the way the world is made. If you live according to wisdom and are diligent and are disciplined, if you can restrain your appetites and defer your wants and do the work you have to do, you'll do well. If you don't do that, you'll fall into ruin. And again, that's just the way God made the world. So again, all the teachings, the moral basis of the election literature is God made a covenant with Israel at Sinai. The moral foundation of wisdom literature is wisdom has been built into creation and into the creation order. Third, matters of priesthood, kosher, and so forth. In the election literature, you have an elect priesthood in the house of Aaron. You have a divinely ordained sanctuary in the tent of meeting initially, and finally in the temple. You have laws regarding cleanness and uncleanness, the kosher laws, and so forth. Those are very, very important, and they are dominant in the election literature. They are completely absent in wisdom. So, for example, in Leviticus, in the first few chapters, what do you have? You have all the rules and regulations for burnt offerings and sin offerings and guilt offerings and peace offerings. And you have many references to making sacrifice throughout the histories and the Psalter and so forth. It doesn't even occur in wisdom literature. It's never mentioned. It's totally absent. Yes?
So when you say distinct, it means to say in the wisdom election, Torah, the priesthood are not included.
They're not mentioned. I'm going to talk about how we should not take this in a moment. All I'm saying for now is they're just not mentioned. Number 4. Idolatry. This is the quintessential sin of the election literature. It is the ultimate form of defying God. To worship another god, to make an idol, to bow down before it. It dominates Torah, it dominates the prophets. In the histories, in a book like Judges, for example, what is the great defiling sin of Israel? Well, time and again, they worshipped Baal. They worshipped idols. In fact, the original besetting sin of Israel in the election literature is what? The golden calf. Exodus 32. It sets the pattern for Israel's sin. And as I say, it totally dominates the election literature as the quintessential sin against God. It is not mentioned in wisdom literature. You have all kinds of sins that are mentioned. Violence, bloodshed, murder, adultery, lying, Even things that are just very foolish, like, as I said, laziness. All kinds of issues. Idolatry doesn't come up one time. That is a big difference. Fifth, and I guess we could describe this one in one word as the idea of termination. Surprisingly enough, I guess it's surprising since it's a covenant with God, Torah, or specifically the Sinai covenant, is subject to termination. It's subject to termination, first of all, through Israel's disobedience. In fact, in Deuteronomy already, you have clearly predicted they will disobey the covenant, they will break it, it will be nullified, and a new covenant will have to take its place. This is made explicit in, like, Jeremiah 31, the prophecy of the new covenant. So you have in the Sinai covenant, first of all, the idea of termination through disobedience, but also termination through fulfillment. Because once the fulfillment has come, that which is partial is obsolete. And this, of course, is what Paul talks about in Galatians. Torah was a pedagogue until the promise should come. Once the gospel has come, once faith has come, Paul has said, the young man is no longer under a pedagogue. We are free in Christ. So both because of disobedience on Israel's part and also because of ultimate fulfillment, the Sinai covenant is ultimately replaced by the new covenant. Wisdom, by contrast, is timeless as long as the world endures, because it is right behavior that is built into creation. And that's just intrinsic to reality. Again, it's just intrinsic to reality that if you are a violent person, you're likely to come to a bad end. That if you're lazy, you're likely to fall into poverty. So the wisdom literature is actually timeless in terms of its moral ideals. Six. I seem to have missed one here. Let me... I had missed one. 6. Although I did talk about it. Universality. This is again the fact Torah is for Israel, as we already talked about from Amos chapter 1 and 2, whereas the nations are subject to general rules of morality. We're going to look in a moment at ancient Near Eastern wisdom texts, and we'll specifically look at ancient Near Eastern wisdom texts that pertain to the book of Job. But what we will see is there's a lot of common ground between the ancient Near Eastern wisdom texts, such as the Egyptian texts, various Mesopotamian texts, and biblical wisdom. Now, there are differences as well that we will explore. But the main point is this. The nations understand that there is a kind of truth out there, that there is a wisdom that the world embodies. And so you will have literature from the nations that is very similar to what you have in Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Whereas again, the covenant between the Lord and Israel is unique and specific to that nation. So now we come to 7. 7 has to do with, I guess I would describe it as purpose. Or direction. Let me just read this to you and I'll unpack it. The injunctions of Torah are all theologically based morality or are ritual in nature. The injunctions of Torah are all theologically based morality or are ritual in nature. What do I mean by that? Theologically based means simply, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore, if I give you this statute, you will obey it. So if I say to you, here is the rule governing property law, obey it. Because I am your God, I am your Redeemer. Or, as I say, ritual in nature, don't eat pork. Or make sure that you observe the Day of Atonement. Or here are the rules for making a whole burnt offering. But again, all of it is based on the fact that the Lord is their God, the Lord is in covenant with Israel, and Israel is by covenant bound to obey God. The injunctions of Proverbs are theologically based in the sense, again, that God is creator. But they are all general expressions of morality, or sometimes Proverbs is more social maturity than morality. Very famously, let me read a proverb to you. Proverbs 27:14. Whoever blesses his neighbor with a loud voice rising early in the morning will be counted as cursing. In other words, if you greet your neighbor really loudly at 6 a.m. in the morning, you might as well cuss him out, because that's how he'll feel about it. Now, that's not really a moral issue. That's a matter of social maturity. Understanding people are not at their best when they just got out of bed. And you got to give them a few minutes to clear their thoughts before you start engaging with them. So Proverbs has a lot, not a great deal, but it certainly has a fair amount that is based on this is how people are. And so you should learn how to behave in society. Again, whereas Torah is strictly, the Lord is your God. He gave you these rules, Israel, you must keep them. 8, and finally, forgiveness. Election literature provides for forgiveness of sin. If you're guilty of some ritual violation that makes you unclean, there are purification rites you can go through so that you will be rendered clean and you will once again be able to approach the temple. As long as you're unclean, you cannot approach the temple. For your sins, you appeal to the Lord your God, who according to Exodus 34:6 is merciful and compassionate and will hear your prayer. And so you have famously Psalm 51. It's not the only one, but it's the great example where David gives his great prayer of confession and repentance and appeal for forgiveness. Now, compare that to what you read from Lady Wisdom in Proverbs chapter 1. In this chapter, beginning in verse 20, we're not going to read the whole section, but Lady Wisdom is giving her first discourse. And I'll read a couple of verses just to make the point. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in scoffing and fools hate knowledge? She goes on and says, verse 24, because I have called and you refused to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded, because you ignored all my reproof, I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm, your calamity comes down like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. Now, the fear of the Lord is a very important concept in wisdom that I'll briefly deal with in a moment, but at this moment, I want to just make this point. Wisdom as such has no forgiveness to offer. Wisdom does not forgive. If you mess up, if you allow yourself to get into a habit of violence and in a fit of rage kill someone, your life is ruined. You're going to go to prison. You're going to face all kinds of terrible, terrible things. And wisdom has no forgiveness or help to offer. You could have learned wisdom, but you didn't. And you can now read Proverbs and call on Lady Wisdom all you want. It won't do you any good. You might reform your life, but in terms of your past events, there's no rectifying that. If you are lazy and you fall into ruin, well, that's it. God can forgive sins, but violations of wisdom are just going to live with you. God can take the bad results of your sins and use them, and can convert your sorrows into blessings. Wisdom doesn't do that. Wisdom is just wisdom. When you put it all together, there are some really significant differences between wisdom and the election literature. Now, when I say differences, I want you to understand me clearly. I do not mean that the writers of wisdom did not know the election literature. I do not mean that they rejected the election literature. I do not mean that they were in competition with the election literature. It's not a conflict. It's not a competition between two contrasting ideals. But it is two different kinds of texts that you have in the Bible. So again, if you wanted to summarize it real briefly, you could say this. The election literature is for Israel as the covenant people, and everything is bounded on their unique relationship to God and to fulfilling God's purpose in choosing them. Wisdom is universal. Wisdom is for all peoples, and as we will see, many people search for wisdom. What about that little axiom, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, fools despise wisdom and understanding, Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Well, the point there is, if you really want to master wisdom, begin by knowing God. If you know God, you will have a big leg up on understanding wisdom, and certainly that's true. God is the Creator. And if you understand and know the one who created heaven and earth, you will have a much better opportunity to understand the wisdom that He built into heaven and earth. But they are different. Let me give you just very briefly a couple of excerpts from ancient Near Eastern wisdom, not related to Job, but more related to Proverbs, to illustrate my point. This is from an Egyptian text called the Instruction of Ani. Just listen, don't try to write this down or anything. Beware of a woman who is a stranger, one not known in her town. Don't stare at her when she goes by. Do not know her carnally. a deep water whose course is unknown. Such is a woman away from her husband. I am pretty, she tells you daily when she has no witnesses. She is ready to ensnare you. A great deadly crime when it is heard. And then elsewhere, the teachings of Ani say, keep away from a hostile man. Don't let him be your comrade. Well, what do you have there? You have something, first of all, very similar to Proverbs 7. The woman who entraps the young man who's passing by in the street, who entices him with the promise of sexual favors and leads him down the path to death. Keep away from violent men. Very, very similar, for example, to Proverbs 1. My son, when they entice you to join their company, to waylay someone by the road, to beat him and to rob him, don't listen. So it is a very, very similar approach to basic morality. Here's a couple of excerpts from the teachings of Amenemope, also from Egypt. And again, don't worry about writing this. This is just illustration. Do not covet a poor man's goods, nor hunger for his bread. Do not pounce upon a widow when you find her in the fields, and then fail to be patient with her reply. Do not refuse your oil jar to a stranger. Double it before your brothers. God prefers him who honors the poor to him who worships the wealthy. Now, what do we have here? We have basic teachings on charity, that it is wise to, first of all, be kind to the poor. Don't plunder their goods, take advantage of them such as they have. Be generous when they ask you. If a widow owes you money, be patient. Don't jump on her and force her to pay. And this last little axiom, God prefers him who honors the poor to him who worships the wealthy. So again, very, very similar to basic biblical morality. So my point here is not that ancient Near Eastern wisdom is in all points equal to or as good as biblical wisdom, not at all. But the point is this: there is a common ground and a common body of literature. What I'd like to do now is take a look specifically at parallels to Job. Parallels to the book of Job. How are we doing here? All right, here we go. There are a few texts that you need to know about just to get a sense of what's going on between the ancient Near Eastern wisdom and Job. Man and his God. This is Sumerian. It's called, these are the titles. Man and his God. Titles as they are known in the literature today. Second, a dialogue. Between a man and his God. This is Old Babylonian. By Old Babylonian, we mean the Babylonian Empire of Hammurabi, roughly 19th century BC. Next one has a rather difficult, because the title it's known by is Akkadian, but you will see a text referred to as Ludlul Bel Nemeki, which means, if you want to just use the English, in praise of the Lord of wisdom. Ludlul Bel Nemeki. And that's Akkadian. And then finally, the dialogue of pessimism. Dialogue of pessimism, which is also Akkadian. All right, and what are these texts? And why are they significant? Well, first of all, what have I tried to establish with you? I've tried to establish that wisdom literature is distinctive within the Old Testament. Not opposed to the election literature, but distinctive within it. And that it is essentially based in the fact that God is creator of heaven and earth. We can in some ways think of it as analogous to the exploration of natural theology. It is thus, in a sense, much closer to the work of the other ancient Near Eastern societies. The covenant between Yahweh and Israel in the election literature is unique. But the other nations, as I said, they had this wisdom tradition of exploring the world and trying to understand it and trying to distinguish right from wrong. So that's where we've come. Now we've come to these specific wisdom texts, all of them Mesopotamian, Sumerian, roughly 2200 BC, 3rd millennium BC, and these various Akkadian texts, all of them 2nd millennium BC. And I want to point out similarities between these books and Job, but the purpose of pointing this out may surprise you a bit. First of all, what are they? The man and his God, the Sumerian texts. Just to give you a very brief summary of it, I think I also have an excerpt here from it. Yeah, here we go. All right. This is a man who complains that despite his piety and his wisdom, he is reviled by everyone. He is depressed, but he confesses his sin before heaven and he is delivered. It is somewhat similar to Job, although it also has similarity to certain Psalms. But let's read a few excerpts from it. It begins with a lament, and here's a few words of the lament. Tears, lament, anguish, and depression are lodged within me. Suffering overwhelms me like a weeping child. In the hands of fate, my features have been changed. All my breath of life has been carried off. Asag, who is a demon, the evil one, bathes my body. So he feels himself to be sick, dying, and afflicted by a demon. His confession. I, the young man, shall publicly declare my sins before you. In the assembly let tears fall like a heavy downpour of rain. And then the thanksgiving. This man, his God, verily heard his bitter weeping. He turned the young man's suffering into joy. So you have, especially in his lament, some material that's quite similar to Job's laments, when Job talks about how sick he is, how horrible he feels, how people despise him. But then he confesses his sin, and then he thanks God because apparently he was healed, or thanks whatever God he was turning to. The dialogue between a man and his God is a shorter Babylonian text, as I say. It's basically a man who prays to his God for healing and receives it, and afterwards he exhorts people to feed the hungry and show kindness to their servants. So to read an excerpt from this, again, this is an old Babylonian text, roughly 1900 BC. A young man was imploring his God as a friend. He was constantly supplicating. He was praying to him. His heart was seared. He was sickened with his burden. His feelings were somber from misery. And then we read a little later, the God speaks. I am your God, your creator, your trust. My guardians are strong and alert on your behalf. The field will open to you its refuge. I will see to it that you have long life. And then it goes on and gives this exhortations. So without qualms do you anoint the parched, feed the hungry, water the thirsty. And so with his God on his side, he exhorts people to be charitable. So what do you have here? Once again, a person who was sick, who was suffering, who turned to his God and appealed to him for help, and his God heard him and healed him. And then you have this concluding moral exhortation. So that is the dialogue of a man and his God. Ludlul Bel Nemiki, a much longer text. Again, the meaning is, I will praise the Lord of wisdom. Now the Lord of wisdom here is Marduk, the god Marduk. And as I say, it's a lengthy text, but I'll read you a number of excerpts. It begins with a praise for Marduk. Marduk, the skies cannot sustain the weight of his hand. His gentle palm rescues the moribund. He it is, in brunt of whose anger the graves are dug. So when he gets angry, people die. At the same moment, raised the fallen from disaster. So he can raise people up who have fallen into ruin. He glowers, protective spirits take flight. He regards, the one whose God forsook him returns. So basically, if Marduk's on your side, all the spirits who were with you, your good luck and everything, they all flee. If Marduk turns against you, if Marduk is on your side, everything goes well. His severe punishment is harsh and speedy. He stops short and quickly returns to his natural state. But then in the poem, the speaker describes his enemies and his illness. Now, as I read this, think about some of the speeches of Job. When I lay down at night, my dream was terrifying. The king, incarnation of the gods, son of his peoples, his heart hardened against me, and appeasing him was impossible. Courtiers were plotting hostile action against me. They gathered themselves to instigate base deeds. If the first, and this is the first person who comes against him, says, I will make him end his life, unquote. Says the second, quote, I ousted him from his command. So likewise the third, quote, I will get my hands on his post. Next, I'll come into his property, vows the fourth. Next, as the fifth subverts the mind of 50, sixth and seventh follow at his heels. So in other words, if you had a little trouble following that, he's naming 7 enemies, 7 people who are turning against him, who want to ruin his life, who want to take his position, who want to take his property, and so forth. The clique of 7 have massed their forces. My best friend made my life an aspersion. My slave cursed me openly in the assembly. My slave girl defamed me before the rabble. An acquaintance would see me and make himself scarce. My family disowned me. Now, if you recall, Job chapter 30 is very, very similar to that. For lack of food, my features are unrecognizable. My flesh is waste. My blood has run dry. My bones are loose, covered only with skin. My tissues are inflamed, afflicted with gangrene. I took to bed, confined. Going out was exhaustion. My house turned into a prison. My flesh was a shackle. My arms were useless. My person was a fetter. My feet gave way. My afflictions were grievous. The blow was severe. So when you've read the Lamentations of Job, they're very similar, aren't they? But after this section, Marduk sends a series of spirits to him in dreams who exorcise whatever affliction he had, an exorcism. So to give you a little example of this, a second time I saw a dream. In the dream I saw at night a remarkable purifier, holding in his hand a tamarisk rod of purification. He names a god, Laluralima, resident of Nippur, has sent me to cleanse you. He was carrying purifying water. He poured it over me. He pronounced the resuscitating incantation. He massaged my body. So in other words, this spirit who was sent to him did a ritual of purification. And then finally the thanksgiving. Marduk, he restored me. He smote the hand of my smiter. It was Marduk who made him drop his weapon. So what do we have here? We have this man who suffers greatly, and he describes how everyone had turned against him. He describes in detail his physical suffering, and then he describes how through this ritual purifications performed by these divine agents of Marduk, he is restored. The last one we're going to look at briefly is, the last one, the Babylonian Theodicy. The Babylonian Theodicy. Did I even mention that one? I'm sorry, I may not have. The dialogue of pessimism, but I skipped over we're not going to look at the dialogue of pessimism. That doesn't really have a lot that's of interest to us. The Babylonian Theodicy is the one I really should have mentioned. Sorry. This one is closest in content to the book of Job. The Babylonian Theodicy, it is written in Akkadian. It is late 2nd millennium BC, roughly 1100 BC. And it is a dialogue between a sufferer and his friend, in which the sufferer complains that his piety does no good. And the friend tries to persuade him to remain devout and to remain pious and to not turn away from his God. So let me read you a little bit from the Babylonian Theodicy. This is a dialogue. The sufferer says, "The savage lion that devoured the choicest meat, did it bring its offerings to appease a goddess's anger? The nobody who multiplies his wealth, did he weigh out precious gold to the mother goddess for a family?" Now, what he's saying there is and the lion here represents violence. People who are violent, who are greedy, who are rapacious, who take other people's land, they disregard the gods. They don't perform any of their rites. They don't bring incense, but they prosper anyway. So he's complaining that often the wicked prosper, those who don't honor the gods. The friend, and I'm only reading short excerpts here, it's a much longer work. "For the atrocity that the lion committed, the pit yawns for him." In other words, the lion is going to go down to destruction. The lion here representing, of course, violent men. "The well-heeled nobody who treasured up possessions, the king will put him to the flames before his time. Would you wish to go the way these have gone?" So what you can notice is, just like Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, this friend tries to convince the sufferer, well, yes, the gods do punish the wicked. The sufferer says, "Those who pray to a goddess have grown poor and destitute. Indeed, in my youth, I tried to find out the will of my God. With prayer and supplication, I besought my goddess. I bore a yoke of profitless servitude. My God decreed poverty for me instead of wealth. A cripple rises above me. A fool is ahead of me. Rogues are in the ascendant. I am demoted. I will open a well. I will let loose a flood. I will roam about the far outdoors like a bandit. I will stave off hunger by forcing entrance into one house after another. I will prowl the streets, casting about, ravenous." Notice what he says here. He says, I tried to be pious. It didn't work. No matter how much I tried to be good and righteous, things just went wrong for me. I'm just going to become a criminal. I'm going to go out, I'm going to break into houses, I'm going to steal stuff. So this is the sufferer speaking. The friend replies, you have let your subtle mind wander. You have overthrown wisdom. You have spurned propriety. You have besmirched every ethical code. The godless swindler who acquires wealth, a deadly weapon is in pursuit of him. Unless you serve the will of a god, what will be your profit? He who bears a god's yoke shall never want for food, though it may be meager. Seek after the favorable breeze of the gods. What you lost for a year, you will recoup in a moment. So notice, if you will, how similar his advice is again to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. You're overturning wisdom. You're rejecting ancient teachings of right and wrong. You're going to undermine all morality. Serve God. Turn back to Him, and you will prosper. You will do well. To end it, the sufferer, he says, they extol the words of an important man who's accomplished in murder. They denigrate the powerless who has committed no crime. They esteem truthful the wicked to whom truth is abhorrent. They reject the truthful man who heeds the will of the God. So what is the sufferer saying there? He's saying basically immorality is rampant. Immorality is everywhere. The world is just a complete chaos, and there's no point in trying to stand for what is right. He concludes, the end of it all, the sufferer says, you're sympathetic, my friend. Be considerate of my misfortune. Help me. See my distress. You should be cognizant of it. Though I am humble, learned suppliant, I have not seen help or succor for an instant. So it ends on kind of a sad note. This sufferer, he just turns to the friend who's been counseling him and he says, well, show me sympathy, show me mercy. I've tried, nothing has worked, everything is going wrong, and I don't know what to make of it. And that's where it ends. Now, I've tried to make the point that you have this kind of international wisdom, and that biblical wisdom literature is aware of that. And that biblical wisdom literature is in some degree interacting with it. But now here's one thing that may be surprising to you. There is a kind of common sense, basic understanding of, if you will, right and wrong and justifying the ways of God. And it's basically this. God rewards those who seek Him, those who are pious, those who are righteous. God punishes the wicked. As we've seen from this ancient Near Eastern literature, that's not unique to Israel. That is very, very widespread. Really, it's universal, even if they don't use the word God, and actually many of them do use the word God. But it's a very widespread understanding. And in general, of course, it's true. But there are a lot of exceptions. And Job is dealing with the problem of theodicy. It's dealing with the question of, what are we to make of it when the righteous suffer? What are we to make of it when the wicked thrive? And common sense, basic traditional morality, traditional conformity to old-fashioned standards would say, well, maybe you don't understand it, maybe you don't have all the information, but God really is punishing all the wicked. God really is protecting all those who serve Him and fear Him, and you just gotta if you think that you are suffering unjustly, just go back and serve God with all the more vigor, and God will finally reward you. Just keep praying. Keep doing what's right. And that's pretty much as much an answer as normally we can give, right? And that is, in fact, exactly the answer that is given in these pagan sources. Now, they're talking about the gods, but their answer is basically the same. Don't despise traditional morality. Don't reject the view that the gods reward the righteous and punish the wicked. Continue to serve God, continue to behave rightly, and everything will be okay. And that is exactly the advice that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar give to Job. Now, here's the kicker. At the end of the book, what does God say? He says to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, "You have not spoken rightly of me, as my servant Job has." And that's what makes Job so disconcerting. Job speaks to, if you will, kind of a universal sense of dealing with the problem of theodicy, the justice of God, the righteous sufferer. And yet it does it in a way that is radically different. It does it in a way that knocks the reader on his heels. Was the author of Job aware of these texts? I am certain he was aware of them, at least generally, of this broad tradition. Whether he knew this specific text or that specific text, who knows? There's no way we can know. But he is very clearly aware of the basic common sense wisdom answer to the problem of suffering. He voices it again and again and again in Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and he says it's wrong. And that's what makes Job so surprising and so difficult.